COVID. I mean, I feel like every conversation I have these days comes back to it.
From a personal point of view, it's been mentally and emotionally draining. So many lockdowns, so many changes without proper justification. And as a young person, we're always seeking, answers or responses because we have an idea of social media, we have an idea of research, and so it's been emotionally like a bit of a turmoil. Seeing so many friends of mine falling ill to COVID, the whole risk of going out and getting COVID.
Actually, I didn't really escape it that much. It was more in my last year of university that I felt the impact of lockdown, and the quality of education severely decreased. It degraded so much because so much of my degree, which was journalism and creative writing, depended on that face-to-face interaction and the ability to soundboard ideas quite quickly with a lot of different people and do hands-on training, hands-on activities that were more interactive and less lecture style was lost. In terms of my mental health, I returning back to society after lockdown was kind of hard because I just had so much anxiety that I never used to have before. I just didn't know whether I could trust whether it was safe to actually go outside.
These lockdowns have affected my mental health a lot, and I just want them to end, but only in the way that they end that the restrictions and lockdowns end because we beat COVID. That's all. Let's beat COVID. That's all.
But I do still remember, the early years when, over-policing was a huge issue in the western suburbs of Sydney versus the northern suburbs, northern beaches and eastern suburbs, where, people were going to the beaches, they were doing everything, and it seemed to everyone no kind of policing was happening and no kind of consequences were happening, and yet COVID cases were coming out because of those events, and yet Western Sydney seemed to cop a lot of the flack, a lot of the backlash, and it seemed to always be our fault, even when it wasn't. Yeah, it was just such a horrible time because I felt like I would know people who would, know other people who were arrested or were being targeted by police. I had friends and family who were racially profiled by police and asked, you can't sit there, you can't have lunch there, you can't sit there and have coffee, and you got to keep moving. And that was quite personal when you're hearing it on a one-on-one basis.
I mean, I work in retail. At one point a few weeks ago, all of my staff were isolating. I was the only one left in the shop.
Actually quite disappointed at the way that we handled the COVID-19 waves and, how the national government, the federal government, has handled COVID-19. Everything from, the vaccination bungles, not ordering enough, not staying in contact with Pfizer, not contacting Pfizer in the beginning, having shortages of vaccines because of that, not being able to do the vaccine rollout on time because of that, and all of the subsequent issues that occurred. We had, I truly believe because of that, we had extended amounts of COVID cases, we had extended amounts of COVID deaths that could potentially have been prevented by an on-time COVID vaccine rollout.
I think it's been quite poor, to say the least, especially with the distribution of vaccinations, distributions of rat tests, the premature removal of masks and QR codes, which sort of baffled the entire community as it did for me. And, it wasn't really justified as we saw the cases increase exponentially. So in my personal opinion, I think the government didn't handle it as properly as it should be. We've seen Scott Morrison come out and take blame essentially and apologize for it, which is an indication that in general, even the government knows it wasn't taking it seriously.
And then when you listen to Scott Morrison on the news and in press conferences, it really does seem at times that he takes a flippant response. And I think a good example of that was, when we were coming into the summer, 2021, 2022 summer, and it was all about personal responsibility, about, living with COVID, living with the cases and going back to normal. And even Scott Morrison himself, in retrospect, admitted that maybe he was too rushed in pushing us towards a big Christmas.
I think the government hasn't done enough with COVID. I feel like they have done enough and that they became complacent. Initially, I think the government was doing quite a lot to, in the early days of COVID, they did a lot to basically ensure that Australians would not get infected. But I think the government, basically, they were really strong to start with, and the state governments were really strong to start with. I think the federal government could have done a lot more to ensure that we didn't need to ensure that we had our vaccinations early as possible.